Well, Adam, this time of year, everybody wants a prediction. Now, I got to assume that you're going to unveil that or maybe already have on your platform. So we'll direct people to your platform. But I'll talk a little bit more about expectations, let's say, when
Yeah.
we put all this talent together. Of course, Mark Stoops could be the head coach at Texas A&M right now, but he is the dean of coaches in the SEC, and he's staying in Kentucky. And I think that says a lot. And he spoke at SEC Media Days, quite frankly, about we are proud of what we've accomplished here. We have lifted this program from being the laughing stock, the joke, not his words, mine, 3 wins a year, basically, to we're going 7-5, 8-4. They've actually had better seasons than that, obviously, in the last 5 or 6 years. Um, but now, if you look at the last 5 or 6 years, they've kind of hit a plateau or a level. And he's talking about that's not good enough. We want to do more. When you look at this team, it looks pretty impressive on paper. The schedule is always going to be difficult in the SEC. I'm going to throw one figure at you, Adam, before I let you take off on the expectations among the fan base and others. Would be that I've got a favorite stat here that is a favorite because I compiled it and it's my creation of sorts because I started to notice 6 or 7 years ago that these preseason publications are way too conservative with their picks. And so I started to look at how many teams elevate or decline at least 3 games from the previous season. And it shocks people. Every time I ask somebody and I say, how many teams do you think in college football elevated or declined at least in the Power Five, at least 3 games? I get guesses of usually 8, 10, 12, something in that range. 26 last year, and it's usually in the 20s. So out of 70, more than a third of the teams go from 6-6 to 9-3, or 2-10 to 5-7, or the other way. And it just doesn't seem possible when you look at last year's records. Now, that would be a stretch for Kentucky. They went 7-5 in the regular season. For them to elevate to 10-2, and certainly nobody's wanting them to reverse to 4-8. But at the same time, can they make some noise?
Yeah, I think they definitely have the chance to make some noise. One, their schedule is going to present a lot of opportunities to pick someone off because they're going to play a lot of good teams. So if they get one or two on the right Saturday, you know how that thing goes. Going back to Stoops' comments about the want
Yeah.
more, I think that was an important. I think he was really kind of trying to speak directly to Kentucky's fan base at that time because in this rise under Stoops, Kentucky had felt like they had passed really South Carolina, Tennessee, and Missouri, kind of in that East pecking order. Now the East's not a thing anymore, but that mattered back then. But in the last 2 years, they've seen Tennessee go 10-2 and really be a true national title contender in 2022. And then they saw Missouri go 10-2. Both those teams get into the new playoff, where Kentucky in their best years probably doesn't get into the new playoff. So to me, it was kind of him saying like, "Hey, that is the goal. We're still trying to break some more glass ceilings or whatever." So that's what I think that message meant. Because there is a lot of frustration I think within the fan base because they feel like Kentucky really missed a golden opportunity. I think really these last 2 years with what they had at quarterback, what the schedule presented, and now they're entering a new world without divisions. I think there's some worry or concern that that the program might be slipping backwards. And so heading into this year and the expectations, most fans, I believe, in the fan base realize the gauntlet that they're about to face. Uh, Everyone knows Georgia, but they recognize Texas is going to be tough on the road. Recognize Ole Miss is going to be tough on the road. That's 3 top 10 teams, and they recognize that Tennessee is just a thorn in their side that they just can't figure out. So right away, that just lowers the ceiling because that's 4 games that I think most people really have kind of accepted that they're probably not going to win. And so to me, like the season is probably considered it's considered success no matter what if they get to 8-4. But 8-4 would mean that they're probably winning all of their toss-up games or most of their toss-up games. So it could be hard to get there. But I think a 7-5 season could be considered a success. You would have to beat South Carolina, you would have to beat Louisville, and you would have to really like look like a good competitive football team. And Brock Vandagriff would have to be really good and show some signs. And so that's where I kind of feel like Kentucky is at, kind of that 7-5 and 8-4. I think 8-4 would help calm everyone down and moving forward, especially if Vandegrift look like he's like a real deal type quarterback, because then that could get you really looking forward to the 2025 season. But it feels like the ceiling is lower for Kentucky this year, not necessarily because of roster. I think if you gave them Missouri's schedule, let's just say, or maybe even Ole Miss's schedule, you could look in the path to maybe 10-2 seems a lot more possible there. But with this schedule, it's hard to see them getting there. And so I think they're looking at kind of that 7-5 and 8-4. 8-4 would be a no doubt, I think, success. 7-5 could be seen as a success by some, depending on how it played out. But it would also look like the 3 7-5s in a row. It would almost feel like they're sputtering a little bit as a program, especially if they lose a lot of star power and draft picks off this team, specifically this defense, which looks like that's probably going to happen when that draft time comes around.
Yeah, it is a tough schedule despite being light on the non-conference side as it typically is for Kentucky with the one big game against Louisville, of course. But I'm not going to give up on the Ole Miss game. I'm not going to give up on that one. I know it's on the road, but I certainly saw this team, what was it, 2 years ago, drive into the red zone and should have won the game at Vaught Hemingway. And I know that this Ole Miss defense is better than that one, but still, I'm not necessarily going to give up on that one because we're going to see some upsets as we always do. And about 25% of the games in the top 25 each week are upsets. So if they pull one off this year, that's the one I'm looking at right now.
Yeah, I think important to point out, they played Lane Kiffin Ole Miss twice, 2020 and 2022. Both those games were decided last minute. The first one went into overtime, and the only reason the game ended was Kentucky missed an extra point.
That's right.
So they were right there. I think Kentucky ran for like 430 yards that game and lost. And so that was a bang game. And then 2022, you could argue they probably should have won that game. So you get one break either way in that game. Kentucky's 2-0. So they've played some down to the wire games there. So I think that will help. And I do think if you look at the two that are more likely to pick off, it's probably Ole Miss or Tennessee. And if you just get one of those, and you take care of business elsewhere, then you're entering November or late November, and you're probably going to Texas in a really important game. And if that were to happen, I think Kentucky, that season would be seen as a really great success because then you're going, because of how the schedule sets up at the end, Mark, if you only have 2 losses after that Tennessee game, you handle Murray State, and you're playing Texas on November 23rd. I mean, that game has huge playoff implications for both sides because Texas is probably trying to secure a top seed, and Kentucky's like in that bubble talk. They're late. So if you're able to do that, I think that would matter too, because a lot of this new era, I think for a lot of teams, everyone wants to make the playoff, but I think being in the conversation late in the year is going to matter for teams. Like if you're in the conversation with 2 or 3 weeks left in the play, and like you're playing big, meaningful games against conference competition in November, I think that is a way to please your fan base because they feel like they matter and they feel like they're in the thick of the college football championship hunt for most of the year. And so for Kentucky in that aspect, if they were able to pull one of those off and just had 2 losses going to Texas, that would be, that would almost be almost like an A+ season. I think every Kentucky fan would sign up for that right now if they could lock that in.
Yeah, Adam, as you well know, if you apply the college football playoff rankings to the last 10 years and look at a 12-team field, you're in at 10-2. Even if you get dragged around the field by Texas and Georgia, Kentucky's in at 10-2. Anybody in the SEC and the Big Ten with those schedules, they're in at 10-2. That's the dividing line. 9-3, your percentage drops to maybe 15 or 20% chance. However, it's going to be more about how did you lose these games? If Kentucky's competitive against Texas and Georgia, lose those games, but play really, really strong against what are expected to be 2 of the top 3 or 4 teams in the country, then you've actually made bigger statements with those losses than 80-90% of the wins out there. And then, you're going to have strong wins against potentially Ole Miss, or maybe a 9-3 gets you in if you lose to Tennessee or Ole Miss. On the flip side, not to go the pessimistic route, since we are trying to push Kentucky to playoff contention, but we can't overlook Auburn at Kroger Field as
Sure.
being some kind of automatic W.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out also Kentucky, in their last 10 home games against power conference competition, they are 3-7.
Mm.
Not 3-7 against the spread, 3-7 outright. 3 wins, 7 losses. So that's kind of another underrated storyline in the season. Like, they really need to get some good home wins. That's one thing that's really kind of gone wrong when you kind of look at the last 2 years where they have come up short. They've really come up short at home. They're going on the road and winning some games, but at home is where that's been really disappointing. So they need to win some home games, and that's a big part of this season.
And that's a great point, because I consider that Kentucky home field advantage to be a bit under the radar, not necessarily counted among the best venues in college football, but I think it's an underrated, great home field environment when they're playing a big game against a Georgia or Florida, and they have some hope. We've seen it really rocking there at Kroger Field.
Yeah, and it's not I don't necessarily think it's the fans' fault. Like, this is like the best environments really they've had consistently over the last 2 years. They've really created a fun place, especially in some of these night games. Just the team has come up short in some big moments, and so that is something that they have to get, and that's something that could really get people back on board if you could just win some of these big home games, which have escaped them. Not only big home games, just win home games against your peers in the league, and that's escaped them the last 2 years.
Adam Luckett, Kentucky Sports Radio. You've got the X handle right there. Please track Adam's work right there. Adam, we appreciate you stopping by to break down some Wildcats for us.
Appreciate it, Mark. Y'all have a good one.